My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 29 years old. I never thought a single phone call would crack open everything I had spent years trying to keep neatly boxed away, but that is exactly what happened on the drive to the cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains. We had left in such a rush that morning, the kind of unplanned escape my father, Robert, insisted we needed after another round of family tension back home. A few days in the mountains will clear the air, he had said, as if fresh air could fix what years of quiet resentment had already broken. My older brother Jason sat in the back seat with his arms crossed, already picking at me before we even hit the highway out of Boise. If you spent half as much energy standing up to that boss of yours as you do making excuses for him, maybe you would not be so worn out all the time, Jason muttered, staring out the window at the passing pines. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Some of us actually like having a steady paycheck, Jason. Not everyone gets to coast on family stories about how hard everything was back in the day. The sarcasm slipped out before I could soften it. My mother, Patricia, sitting in the passenger seat, let out one of her long sighs that always managed to say more than words. We were barely an hour into the drive when my phone lit up on the center console. I had meant to switch it to Do Not Disturb, but in the rush, I forgot. The screen showed my boss, Philip Stone, calling. I answered without thinking, and because the car's Bluetooth was still connected from the last podcast, his voice came booming through the speakers loud and clear for everyone to hear. Lauren, I hope you are not letting family drama get in the way of the Henderson project again. Philip said, his tone carrying that familiar mix of concern and control he liked to call generosity. I went out of my way to give you that extra week on the deadline. The least you could do is keep your personal issues from bleeding into client work. Laura in HR has been fielding questions from the team about your focus lately. We cannot afford another round of that. The car went dead silent except for the hum of the tires. My mother's head snapped toward me. Jason leaned forward between the seats. Even my father, who had been pretending to nap, opened his eyes. Philip kept talking, unaware that four people were now listening to every word. He mentioned how he had generously covered for me in a meeting the week before when I had stepped out to take a call from home. He said something about private details I had shared with him, in confidence details about the family cabin and some old money arguments that had apparently made their way to at least two other people on the team. I fumbled for the screen and finally managed to end the call, but the damage was already done. The Bluetooth cut off mid-sentence, leaving his last words hanging in the air like smoke. Just remember who has been looking out for you here, Lauren. Generosity only goes so far when it is not appreciated. Jason let out a low whistle. Well, that explains why you have been walking around like someone kicked your dog. Your boss is out here telling the whole office about our family business. I kept my voice steady the way I always did when the hurt started rising. He was not supposed to repeat any of that. I only mentioned it once when he asked why I looked tired. I thought it was a normal conversation. My mother turned in her seat, her expression tight. You told your boss about the cabin money issues, Lauren. Some things stay inside the family. Now it is out there for strangers to judge. The rest of the drive passed in heavy quiet, broken only by the occasional sarcastic comment from Jason about how I always let people walk all over me, and my father's occasional grumble that work should stay at work. By the time we turned onto the narrow road leading up to the cabin, my chest felt like it was wrapped in wire. The Sawtooth Mountains rose sharp and blue around us, the late afternoon light catching on patches of snow still clinging to the higher ridges. The cabin itself looked smaller than I remembered, the logs weathered but sturdy, the porch sagging a little on one side. It had been in the family for 3 generations, or at least that was the story we always told. We carried our bags inside in silence. The familiar smell of pine and old wood hit me the moment I stepped through the door. My father started a fire in the stone fireplace, while my mother unpacked groceries in the tiny kitchen. Jason dropped his duffel on the couch and immediately started scrolling on his phone, probably texting his wife back in town about what a mess the drive had been. I slipped away to the small bedroom at the back, the one that used to be mine on summer visits when I was a kid. That was when I saw the old photo album sitting on the dresser. It had not been there the last time we came up. The leather cover was cracked and faded. I opened it without thinking, flipping through pictures of family trips from years ago. My parents smiling on the porch, Jason and me as teenagers, pretending to fish in the creek out back. Then I reached a page near the back and stopped. There was a photograph of the cabin being built, or at least that was what the caption claimed. On the back, written in faded blue ink, someone had scrawled a message that made my stomach drop. Robert, the money for this place did not come from your hard work story. We both know where it really came from. Do not let the kids grow up thinking the family success was clean. Nathan. Nathan Brooks. The name hit me like a stone. He had been a family friend years ago, the one who used to help my father with odd jobs around the property. I had not heard his name in over a decade. The message was dated almost 20 years earlier. My father had always told us the cabin was built with money he saved from working construction and a small inheritance from his own parents. This note said otherwise. It suggested the story we had all inherited was at least partly a lie. I stared at the photograph until the lines blurred. My boss had somehow known pieces of our family tension. Now, an old note was telling me the success story itself might have been falsified from the start. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket without saying anything and walked back into the main room. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Allison Ford, the only person at work I actually trusted. Allison. Hey, just so you know, Philip was in the break room earlier telling anyone who would listen that you have been distracted by family drama and that he has been carrying your workload out of the goodness of his heart. Laura from HR was nodding along like it was gospel. You might want to check your email when you have signal. There's a thread floating around. I sat down on the edge of the couch, phone in my hands, the weight of the photograph in my pocket feeling heavier than it should. Outside the cabin windows, the mountains were turning purple in the dusk. Inside, my family moved around each other with the careful distance of people who had been pretending everything was fine for a very long time. My father glanced over from the fireplace. Everything all right over there, Lauren? I forced a small smile, the kind I had perfected over years of swallowing the sharp comments and the quiet exclusions. Just work stuff. Nothing that cannot wait until Monday. But it could not wait. Not anymore. The phone call on speaker had already let the first crack show. The old photograph was widening it, and somewhere in my work email, an undeleted thread was apparently telling a version of my life that my boss had decided to share without my permission. I looked around at my mother, my father, and my older brother, all pretending not to notice the tension thick enough to cut. For the first time in a long while, I wondered how many other stories we had all been telling ourselves just to keep the peace. The mountains outside stayed silent, but inside the cabin, the air felt like it was waiting for the next thing to break. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, but the warmth did not reach the space between any of us. I sat on the worn couch with the old photograph still folded in my jacket pocket, the weight of Nathan Brooks's faded handwriting pressing against my ribs every time I shifted. Outside the cabin windows, the sawtooth peaks had disappeared into full dark, and the only sounds were the occasional pop of burning wood and the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My mother, Patricia, moved around the small space with deliberate calm, setting out plates for a dinner none of us seemed hungry for. My father, Robert, poked at the logs with an iron poker like the motion itself could rearrange the evening. My older brother, Jason, had claimed the armchair and was still glued to his phone, though I caught him glancing at me every few minutes with that familiar mix of concern and judgment. I pulled out my own phone and opened the work email app. The signal was weak this far up the mountain, but it was enough. Allison Ford's text had been right. There, it was an email thread that had clearly been forwarded and replied to more times than it should have been. The subject line read, Performance Notes, L. Mitchell, Family Distractions. I clicked it open, keeping the screen angled away from the others, even though part of me no longer cared who saw. The first message was from my boss, Philip Stone, to Laura Simmons in HR, dated 3 days earlier. Laura, just a heads up on Lauren. She's been stepping out more than usual for personal calls. I've been generous with her deadlines on the Henderson account because I know family stuff can hit hard, but the team is starting to notice. She mentioned some ongoing issues with her parents and the family property up in the mountains. I've tried to keep it contained, but if it starts affecting client deliverables, we may need to document for the next review cycle. Let me know how you want to handle the supportive conversation angle. Laura's reply sat right below it, timestamped the next morning. Appreciate the flag, Philip. I'll add it to her file as a coaching note. Generosity is good until it enables poor boundaries. We can frame it as us looking out for her long term fit here. Maybe suggest she take some personal time if the family cabin situation is that disruptive. I'll loop in if we need to move toward a formal plan. There were two more replies after that, both of them discussing how to protect the team culture while making sure I understood the company had been patient. No one had asked me a single question. They had simply decided what my life looked like and written it down in an email thread that apparently half the department had now seen. I felt the old familiar burn behind my eyes, the one that came whenever someone took my private pain and turned it into a performance problem. My boss had taken the one thing I had told him in a moment of exhaustion, how the cabin trips always stirred up old money arguments between my parents, and how I sometimes felt like I was still the kid trying to keep everyone calm, and he had handed it to HR like it was evidence I could not be trusted. He had called it generosity, the same word he used when he gave me extra projects that kept me working late while he took credit in meetings. The same word he used when he reminded me how lucky I was to have a boss who understood work life balance better than most. I locked the phone screen and slipped it back into my pocket. The photograph felt even heavier now. Lauren, you going to help set the table or just sit there staring at that screen all night? My mother asked from the kitchen, her voice light in the way that meant she was trying not to start another argument. I stood up slowly. I found something in the old album on the dresser, a picture of this place when it was being built. There was writing on the back from Nathan Brooks. The name landed in the room like a dropped plate. My father stopped poking the fire. My mother's hands went still on the stack of plates. Jason actually looked up from his phone. My father cleared his throat. Nathan always had a way of stirring things. That note is probably 20 years old. Nothing worth digging up now. What did it say? Jason asked, leaning forward. I pulled the photograph out and held it so they could see the back without handing it over. I read the words out loud, keeping my voice even though every syllable tasted bitter. Robert, the money for this place did not come from your hard work story. We both know where it really came from. Do not let the kids grow up thinking the family success was clean. My mother set the plates down harder than necessary. Nathan Brooks was jealous of your father for years. He helped with some of the early work on the cabin and then got it in his head that he was owed more than he was paid. That note was just him being petty before he moved away. We bought this place fair and square with money your father earned and a little help from his parents. End of story. The way she said it was too quick, too practiced. I had heard that same tone my whole life whenever anyone got close to asking why certain bills were always paid in cash or why family gatherings always ended with someone reminding everyone how much they had sacrificed. The controlled narrative they had built about our family's success was starting to show the same cracks my boss's generosity had been hiding behind at work. Jason let out a short laugh that did not sound amused. Great. So now we are up here in the mountains with no cell service half the time, and apparently the family legacy is built on whatever Nathan decided to scribble on a picture 20 years ago. Perfect timing, Lauren. I did not put the album there, I said quietly. It was already on the dresser when we walked in. My father finally turned from the fireplace, his face set in the same stubborn lines I had seen every time money or the past came up. Some things are better left in the past, Lauren. Your boss calling like that earlier was already enough drama for one day. We came up here to get away from all that, not to go digging through old photos and old grudges. I felt the sarcasm rise before I could stop it. Right. Because pretending everything is fine has worked so well for all of us so far. My boss thinks he can leak my private conversations to HR and call it looking out for me. You all think you can rewrite where the money for this cabin actually came from and call it family history. I am starting to see a pattern. The room went quiet again, but this time the quiet had edges. My mother picked up the plates and carried them to the table without another word. My father went back to the fire. Jason shook his head and muttered something about always making everything about her, then went back to his phone. I stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the door closed behind me. The mountain air was sharp and cold, the kind that bit at your lungs and made everything feel clearer and more painful at the same time. My phone buzzed in my hand. Another text from Allison. Allison, the thread is still circulating. Someone printed it and left it on the break room table. Philip is telling people he had no choice but to document because he has been carrying you. Laura backed him up in the all hands this afternoon. You okay up there? I typed back with fingers that felt numb from more than the cold. Me. Not really. But I have the emails now, and I found something else up here that is making me wonder how many stories I have been told my whole life. I hit send and slipped the phone into my jacket next to the photograph. Inside the cabin, I could hear my mother and father talking in low voices, the words too muffled to make out, but the tone familiar, defensive, circling, protecting the version of the story they had always told. My older brother's laugh cut through once, sharp and short. My boss had used his position and his carefully worded generosity to turn my private struggles into something that could be used against me at work. My family had used their own version of generosity, the story of how hard they had worked, how much they had given up to keep the real history of this cabin buried. Both narratives were starting to collapse, and I was the one standing in the middle holding the pieces. I stayed on the porch a long time watching the stars come out over the sawtooth ridges and feeling the cold settle into my bones. The email thread was saved. The photograph was in my pocket. And for the first time in years, I was not sure I wanted to keep protecting either version of the truth anymore. Inside, someone turned on the old radio. A country song played low, the kind that always came on when my father wanted to fill the silence. I stayed outside until the song ended, and the only sound left was the wind moving through the pines. The cold mountain morning hit different after a night of almost no sleep. I woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of my parents talking in the kitchen like they were trying not to wake the rest of the house. My older brother Jason was already on the porch with his coffee, staring at the ridges like they might give him answers. I stayed in bed a few extra minutes, the photograph and the saved email thread both sitting on the nightstand, like evidence in a case I had not asked to try. When I finally came out, the conversation stopped. My mother, Patricia, set a mug in front of me without asking how I took it. My father, Robert, kept his eyes on his plate. Jason gave me the same look he had used since we were kids, the one that said I was about to make everything more complicated than it needed to be. I sat down anyway and pulled out my phone. I saved the email thread from work, the one my boss sent to HR about me. He called the things I told him in private family distractions and framed himself as the generous one for covering for me. Laura and HR agreed with him. They have been circulating it. My mother's hand tightened on her coffee mug. Lauren, we came up here to get away from work. Can we please have one morning without... I am not bringing it up to complain. I said keeping my voice even. The sarcasm I felt stayed inside where it belonged. I am bringing it up because I am done pretending that people using the word generosity to control me is normal, at work or here. Jason set his mug down harder than necessary. Here we go again. You always turn everything into some big stand. Dad built this cabin with his own hands. Nathan Brooks was just bitter because he did not get a bigger cut of whatever side job he did back then. Why are you digging this up now? I slid the photograph across the table so the handwriting faced them. Because the note is not just bitter. It says the money did not come from the story we were all told. And after last night's phone call on speaker, I am starting to think the stories we tell ourselves are the only thing holding any of this together. My father finally looked up. His face had the same stubborn set it always got when money or the past was mentioned. Nathan helped with some framing and then decided he deserved more than we agreed on. Your mother and I handled the rest. That is the truth. The way he said it was too clean. I had heard that same tone my whole life whenever questions got too close to the edges. My mother stayed quiet, which told me more than any denial would have. I stood up and carried my mug to the sink. I am going to step outside and make a call. When I come back in, I would appreciate it if we could talk like adults instead of circling the same old story. The porch was empty this time. I pulled up the number I'd found in an old address book tucked behind the radio. Nathan Brooks. The handwriting on the note matched the shaky signature in the book. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the third ring voice, rough with age, but still sharp. Brooks. Mr. Brooks, this is Lauren Mitchell, Robert and Patricia's daughter. I'm at the cabin. I found the note you wrote on the back of the construction photo. There was a long pause, then a low chuckle that did not sound amused. Took you long enough to find it. I left that album out the last time I was up there, hoping someone would finally ask the right question. Your father always was better at rewriting history than he was at paying people what he owed them. He did not sugarcoat it. The money for the early work on the cabin had come from a settlement after a workplace injury my father had downplayed for years. Nathan had done most of the heavy lifting on the framing and never saw his full share. The hard work and family inheritance story had been the version my parents chose to tell us and everyone else, so the cabin would look like proof of their success instead of a reminder of what had actually been paid for in pain and quiet deals. I thanked him and hung up. My hands were steady, but something inside my chest had shifted. The inherited story I'd carried about this place, about my family's grit and clean success, was gone. In its place was something smaller and more honest. It hurt, but it was cleaner. Back inside, the three of them were still at the table. I set my phone down where they could all see the screen. The email thread was open. My boss has been using the same trick I said. He calls his control generosity. He took things I told him in confidence and turned them into a performance problem he could document with HR. He has been telling the team I am distracted and that he has been carrying me. The thread proves it. I am not asking any of you to fix it. I am telling you I am done protecting versions of the truth that only serve the people telling them. My mother's eyes filled, but she did not cry. Lauren, we never meant for you to carry any of this. I know I said, the gentleness in my voice surprised even me, but carrying it is what I have always done, and I am not disappearing to make it easier for everyone else anymore. My father looked at the email thread, then at the photograph still on the table. For once, he did not have a quick answer. Jason stared at his hands. The controlled narrative my family had kept for decades and the one my boss had tried to build at work were both cracking at the same time, and none of us could pretend otherwise. I stepped back onto the porch and called Philip Stone. I put the phone on speaker on purpose this time. When he answered, his voice carried the same polished concern he always used. Lauren, I hope the mountain air is helping. Laura and I were just discussing how we can support you through this family situation. I have been generous with your workload, but we need to make sure the team does not suffer. I let him finish. Then I spoke clearly the way I had practiced in my head all night. I have the full email thread, Philip, the one where you and Laura decided my private conversations were performance issues you could document. I've already forwarded it to the head of our department and to legal. You can call what you did generosity if it helps you sleep. But it stops here. I am resigning effective immediately, and I am keeping every record of how you chose to handle this. There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke again, the polished tone was gone. Lauren, let's not be rash. We can talk about this when you are back in the office. I have always had your best interests in mind. No, I said. You had your own, and now everyone who needs to know has the proof. I am done. I ended the call before he could answer. The mountains stayed quiet around me. Inside the cabin, my family was still sitting at the table. I went back in and looked at each of them. I am leaving this afternoon, I said. The stories we told about this place and about each other do not have to be the ones I keep carrying. I am not cutting anyone out, but I am not disappearing into the version that makes everyone else comfortable either. My mother nodded, once slow and heavy. My father did not argue. Jason looked like he wanted to say something but stayed quiet. The loss of the old story sat in the room with us, real and final. It hurt in a way that felt clean instead of rotting. I packed my bag, hugged my mother longer than I had in years, and drove down the mountain road with the photograph and the saved emails in the passenger seat. The sawtooth ridges stayed behind me in the rearview mirror. I did not feel the old guilt pulling at me to turn around and smooth everything over. For the first time in a long time, the silence inside the car felt like space instead of absence. Allison called while I was still on the highway. The thread hit the department inbox an hour ago. Philip tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the head of legal already asked for a meeting with him. You did the right thing. I know I said. It does not feel good yet, but it feels like mine. She stayed on the line with me for the rest of the drive back to town, not filling the quiet with advice, just keeping me company. When we hung up, I realized something simple and steady. Real support does not require you to shrink or rewrite yourself to earn it. The people who stay do not make you disappear. You. That night in my own apartment, I sat on the couch with the photograph on the coffee table. The note on the back was still there, the handwriting faded but clear. The family success story I had inherited was gone. The job I had tried to hold on to by staying small was gone too. What was left was quieter and heavier and entirely mine. I had protected my dignity instead of protecting the lies. It cost me the version of my family I had carried for 29 years. It cost me the job I had poured years into. But it did not cost me myself. That was the trait I could finally live with. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of this sounded like something you have lived through, comment healing below. I read every single one